Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Jason Ward. He is the founder and principal analyst of the Center for International Corporate Tax Accountability and Research, CICTAR. At FO Talks today, we are discussing an extraordinarily important global issue, and it is the truth about how multinationals avoid tax. So, without further ado, Jason, how actually do multinationals avoid tax?
Well, sadly, it's quite simple, really. At the end of the day, there's lots of simple tricks that multinationals use to avoid their obligations, and really, this has immense impacts across the globe. I mean, we do have governments should have the funding that we need for public services that everybody needs that reduces inequality, but they're not collecting what they should and can from multinationals who are able to easily shift their profits from where money is made to where it is taxed the least, or in many cases, not taxed at all. So we have made some progress. There is some positive developments, and there will be future positive developments. But this is a major, major global problem in every country that needs the funding to provide essential public services for its citizens, as well as infrastructure that is good for the individual, is good for community, but is also essential for business itself. You can't function a business without proper roads, an educated workforce, a healthy workforce, infrastructure, legal system, and these are all paid for. In part by corporate income tax revenues.
So, let me ask you, yes, you've said they move money to where they are taxed least. But in this day and age where Google, to pick an
Mm,
example of a global company, or for that matter, Meta, or Google is
right,
Alphabet, or even Microsoft, they make money all around the
right.
world. So how, and they sell services,
So,
not just products. Although Microsoft, does sell a few products, so Google also tried to sell a few products, but largely they are selling services. So how do you actually know where is the money coming
right.
from?
Well, Microsoft is a very good example because it is facing the largest tax fine, tax audit in global history. The U.S. IRS is pursuing Microsoft for close to $30 billion in back taxes at the moment. And that may actually be a smaller amount of what is actually owed by Microsoft for previous years of tax avoidance. So the case that they're pursuing is close to 30 billion, but the ultimate figure could be significantly higher than that. And Microsoft has been routing its profits via Ireland for a very long time. Again, some of these things have changed. Ireland is now creating a sovereign wealth fund from its windfall tax revenues from some of the global corporate tax changes that have occurred. And this is a short-term blip, so that's why they're creating a fund for it, because it won't go on forever. Um, but it's an odd twist to global tax reforms that Ireland, a major tax haven country that is depriving tax revenues from around the world, is actually benefiting from the global tax reform system. Um, so, I can.
No, no, I didn't quite understand how are they benefiting from the reform, because usually, I mean, they were the ones who were benefiting because companies were showing profits in Ireland, and that was great. Although not so great if you were lower middle class. The Dublin property market is infamous.
Absolutely.
More importantly,
Yeah. So,
yeah, they moved dramatically in per capita GDP. They moved dramatically in terms of wealth
right.
coming to the country. They became the fast growth story in Europe. So how are they now benefiting when the tide has seems to be turning?
Well,
Frankly,
they're benefiting for two reasons. One is that some of the most egregious loopholes, the double Dutch Irish sandwich, or the ability to shift profits. A lot of companies that set up in Ireland were initially not actually tax resident in Ireland. So their tax residency was in Bermuda, in the Isle of Man, or in some other jurisdiction. And so they actually didn't really pay tax in Ireland. So that has changed, and that is no longer permissible. So they're paying tax in Ireland. And then on top of that, Ireland had a tax rate of 12.5% if you were paying that tax. And again, lots of generous loopholes and reductions to that. But now, as a result of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's tax reforms, and in this case, it's called Pillar Two, which is the minimum global tax, Ireland has raised its tax rate to 15%. So, in the past, companies like Microsoft weren't paying any tax in Ireland or paying very, very, very little tax in Ireland, despite massive revenues reported by Irish subsidiaries. Now they actually are paying significant tax on revenue that, frankly, was not generated in Ireland, but is artificially transferred to Ireland through intellectual property rights, royalties, management service fees, all kinds of internal related party transactions that remove the money from where it was earned or where sales occurred to Ireland, where in the past it was taxed the least. Um, and
So,
Microsoft is, we've looked at Microsoft in a fair amount of detail and can actually kind of document from some jurisdictions, so not from the US, but in other places where there is greater transparency, we can actually see what's going on.
so, I understand they are now benefiting because they are getting increased tax revenues. But walk us through, and you've explained in part, but you mentioned the term double Dutch Irish sandwich. What was this double Dutch Irish sandwich? Sounds suitably exotic. I'm already
It
excited to
sounds
order
delicious.
it on the menu.
And you can have it alongside your Singapore sling.
Indeed.
Or cozy
So
jelly roll.
explain to us what these lovely terms mean. What
Well,
is this lovely sandwich?
let me switch from the sandwich, and just to give you an example of some recent work that we've done where I think it's a very clear, easy case of how this works. And that's, we've done a recent report on
Perfect.
Starbucks coffee, which I think everybody, a brand well recognized around the world. Starbucks
Indeed.
Starbucks has reduced its
By the way, the coffee ain't great at Starbucks. The branding maybe, but the coffee ain't.
absolutely, absolutely. But Starbucks is responsible for about 3% of the global coffee trade of green beans, the raw coffee ingredient. And every single bean that Starbucks purchases on paper is bought and sold in Switzerland. And so since 2011,
Well, lovely.
what Starbucks does, it has a subsidiary in Switzerland, the Starbucks Coffee Trading Company, SARL, and it buys the beans from everywhere around the world, and it marks them up by 18%. So it's capturing 18% of the profit in its internal supply chain in Switzerland, where it's taxed at very low rates. So what that does is that stashes, we've estimated at least $1.3 billion over the last decade in additional profits shifted to Switzerland. And that reduces the taxable income where coffee is sold. So obviously the United States is the biggest market. China is the second biggest market for Starbucks. And that's something we hope to come back and look at in more detail. But because the profit is captured internally in Switzerland, there's less taxable profit where people buy their spice chai macchiato, whatever drinks. And again,
So they're buying it using the Swiss
mm,
entity and then selling it internally to another
right,
Starbucks
and
entity at a higher
and of
price.
course,
And so that profit is booked in Switzerland itself, but it's actually all going to Starbucks.
it's actually all going to Starbucks. And in this case, we think that the money is actually held offshore, and we've been able to trace dividend flows from the Swiss entity through the Netherlands and to the UK. The companies constantly change their structures so that it's harder for tax authorities to pursue them for these types of things.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's a cat and mouse game,
Absolutely,
always.
but
They have some of the cleverest accountants and lawyers on their
they
payroll.
and indeed they do, and this is a very clear classic example because the beans actually never climb up the Swiss Alps, right? The product never actually goes to Switzerland. It's just purely a paper trade. It's fictional, but this also has the impact of reducing the tax revenue in the source country where the coffee is bought because the sale doesn't take place in Colombia or Brazil or China or Indonesia or Tanzania. It takes place in Switzerland. And so it's taxable in Switzerland, but not in the source country. So, you know, Starbucks is amassing
Hang
its
on a
profits
minute.
in Switzerland.
Hang on a minute. How does it work? Because let's say you have a coffee plantation. Let's assume it's in one of the big coffee producing countries in the world. I don't care where it
Right.
is. Let's assume it's in somewhere in South America or Central America for a start. Could be anywhere
Yeah.
else. Now, you physically give the coffee beans to someone. So surely you've received money and someone has received the coffee beans. All right. I'm a lawyer too by training, and I also studied some economics. So you've paid consideration, and someone has got a product. All right. So how can it not be booked in that jurisdiction? I don't get it.
it, it's a very clever accounting trick that is going on. And look, I'm talking about Starbucks and coffee, but this is across a wide range of commodities that again is building global inequality by shifting revenues out of producer
Yeah.
countries and putting them in Switzerland. So Switzerland is at the heart of global commodity trading. So coffee, 50% of global coffee comes from, is traded in Switzerland, more than 50%. And, the same would be true of almost every food commodity, as well as, coal and oil and gas and cobalt and all nature of commodities. But it is, I mean, this is, again, this is
I have to grant it to the Swiss. I mean, who would have thought these simple mountain people would turn out to be so canny?
and look, the Swiss has world class public services. The best hospitals you can find, the best public services, roads, trains. They all work on time, and that's because they've clipped the ticket. They're taking a very small amount of the global commodity trade, and that allows Switzerland to live a life of luxury, but it's really literally stealing tax revenues from around the world, and in a lot of cases from some of the poorest countries in the world.
So the Swiss would argue, look, as the London Stock Exchange argues, that look, we provide a
Yeah.
service because at the end of the day, instead of saying that we are stealing, the Swiss could legitimately say that, look, global trading is not so easy. We allow an institutional mechanism. We provide a global market. We provide a clearance system. We provide guarantees
Mhm.
of delivery, both supplier and buyer. So we are not exactly stealing anybody's lunch or anybody's revenue. We are just getting paid for the service we are providing as a clearinghouse. We are like an
Yeah.
exchange.
So so that is exactly what they'll say, and that's exactly what they do say. But let me tell you a little bit more about the Starbucks story that puts this in context. So the reason that we were able to know about this is because there was a European Commission investigation that concluded in 2015, and they were able to obtain and request and obtain documents from the Starbucks Swiss entity. And we know that they were doing a markup of 3% until 2011, and in after 2011 or in 2011 they changed that markup. So this is the markup from the purchase price to the internal sales price of the beans. They moved it from 3% to 18%, and so that
Wow.
15% margin is I'm willing to accept that there are some costs in Switzerland, that commodity trading requires a certain amount of expertise, knowledge of coffee beans, et cetera, et cetera. But 3% is probably pushing the limit. 18% is absolutely ridiculous and unjustifiable. That is theft in my book.
So they are being usurious, you'd say, and Jesus would not approve.
Absolutely, absolutely. Nor Muhammad.
Okay. So that's what Switzerland is doing. You still haven't explained to us the double Dutch Irish sandwich, this
Right.
extraordinary sandwich.
So, like, let me. I can use an example of
Please.
Uber or Netflix. Microsoft is more or less the same. Essentially, so
I mean, they all
and
use the same trick. I'm sure Google has a big presence in Ireland. I have friends who work for Google and live in Ireland. I'm sure
I'm
everyone is
sure they
using the
do.
same trick, using the
They're
same
all
trick.
using some variant of the same tricks, right? So Uber is a good example, and we've done a fair bit of work on Uber over a number of years as well, and probably we may go down that path once again. But Uber claims to be a technology company and not a transport company. So when
Yeah.
you get a ride from, in my case, from somewhere in Sydney to somewhere outside of Sydney, they're saying that transaction actually occurs in the Netherlands, and
It does. It does. I mean, the technology is all in the Netherlands. I mean, you're misunderstanding
so
Uber.
Uber, it's a super interesting case because Uber actually has more financial flows. My analysis is a bit dated, but I expect the same is true. They had more financial flows than J.P. Morgan Chase, right? Like the amount of money that Uber handles globally via the Netherlands is more than one of the largest banks in the world, right? Because what they're doing is that money is immediately paid from the customer. In my case, in Australia, it goes directly to the Netherlands, and the only money that comes back is what's paid out to the driver. So that whole transaction has occurred in the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands, they created by selling their intellectual property, which used to be housed in Bermuda, to the company in the Netherlands. So again, this is the left arm selling to the right arm. This is more or less a fictional transaction. They created a huge volume of debt, and that debt then becomes a tax shelter, so that you can shift your profits from around the world to the Netherlands and not pay tax there, because the debt from buying your own intellectual property has created an artificial tax shelter that is so. If you're a loss-making business, as Uber was globally for many years, so it was making profits in lots of markets, but not in its primary market in the U.S. I think that's changed. But having your intellectual property held in Bermuda is not helpful. But creating a phony exchange to sell it to the Netherlands then creates a tax shelter going into the future when you are generating global profits. And lots of, like, McDonald's has a variation of this. They had their intellectual property in Singapore and sold it to a UK subsidiary to create a tax shelter in the UK. And companies do this constantly, right? They're changing the structure. They're getting chased by tax authorities in different jurisdictions. So just mix it up and move your intellectual property from here to there. And in the pharmacy, the highest, most aggressive sectors are easily IT, and pharmaceuticals, big pharma. So it's super easy for those businesses to move their intellectual property from one location to another, and they do it all the time.
So you brought in Big Pharma and you've talked about Merck. Paint us a picture of what Big Pharma is doing in general and Merck in particular.
So big pharma is, and I'm specifically talking about the U.S. big pharma companies because I have not spent a huge amount of time on some of the global pharma companies, with one exception of looking at CSL, which is one of the top three companies on the Australian stock exchange, and in that sector. And I can explain about them, but let me go back to Merck. Um, Merck and Pfizer and lots of companies have been under a lot of scrutiny recently and going back many years because they have huge profits, but those profits are generally not booked in the markets, primarily the US, where the vast bulk of the sales occur. And of course, the US is a strange beast globally in terms of not having a public health system and not having restrictions on the prices of pharmaceuticals and the ability for pharmaceutical companies to market directly to consumers, which is an oddity that is really not found many other places on the planet. So huge profits for these companies in the US. But if you hold the patents of those drugs in Ireland or Switzerland or Bermuda, then you can book the profits from those sales in those jurisdictions where they're taxed very lightly or in some cases not at all. And there are lots of countries that have developed what's called a patent box regime, which allows it makes it very easy for these companies to move those patents into that jurisdiction where they are given highly concessional tax rates on money earned from those patents. So the UK has a patent box regime. Switzerland has a patent box regime. So Ireland and Switzerland are probably two, and perhaps the Netherlands are kind of places where big pharma books a lot of their profits by moving the. And again, this is crazy because these companies are heavily reliant on government spending to purchase their drugs. Again, particularly outside of the United States, but even in the United States under Medicaid. And they're also these companies are also benefiting heavily from research and development tax incentives. So huge amounts of public subsidies goes into the research that they are able to then monetize. And the big pharma sector really I mean, their effective tax rates are just incredibly low. So I think Merck had global profits of about 20 billion in the most recent year, but reporting a loss in the US of something like 1.8 billion. So basically paying nothing. And they're able to get away with this. There's been a lot of focus. The Senate Finance Committee has been pushing on big pharma's tactics. Donald Trump has been mentioning the profit shifting of big pharma and is upset about their production in Ireland and has been talking about tariffs on Ireland as a result. Um, so these are huge and growing industries. Which are not contributing back to funding public services in the way that they should, and in fact, in ways that they directly benefit from. I'll give the example of CSL. So this is an Australian company. It used to be a public enterprise, a state-owned enterprise. Um, we looked at them because they were the only vocal opponent to our new legislation in Australia, world-class, best in the world tax transparency legislation that will require multinationals to report on a report publicly on a country by country basis, and they were opposing that. So we asked them. We wondered why, and the research we found was that their Swiss employees generated 10 times the profit of their Australian.
So, Jason, what you've said very clearly is that these multinationals, they are enriching themselves through government spending, and that could be Medicare, Medicaid in the US, and
Mm.
other government procurement programs. So that's one day. Carry on with explaining how they are avoiding paying their taxes whilst they are They are enjoying government spending on procurement, basically buying of medicines under Medicare or Medicaid, as well as government investment in research and development. So they are double dipping. So they are taking from the taxpayer, but they are not then giving back to the same very taxpayer.
Absolutely, and big pharma, I think, is a very clear example of this, is sort of double dipping and taking on the one hand and not giving back on the other. And at the end of the day, it's essentially they're paying themselves for the use of their own intellectual property and putting that intellectual property in either countries or mechanisms within countries that allow them to basically pay very low rates of tax, or in some cases, no tax at all, on the income earned from that intellectual property. And in most cases, that intellectual property owes its existence to some form of public subsidy and public funding, whether it's from public institutions or whether it's through research and development incentives, tax incentives that they've been granted. Um, so at the end of the day, it's actually quite a simple scheme, and obviously we need reforms to make this not permitted, and so that intellectual property should not be able to be transferred and abused in such a way to avoid your tax obligations.
So brilliant. But what are the reforms that you're suggesting?
Well, so
Because at the moment it seems there's a race to the bottom. There's Bermuda, there is Ireland, there's Switzerland, and
so
really the country that raises taxes will just see these companies move out.
So here's one thing that we're moving on this in several levels. I think I was trying to say before, we've in Australia we've passed world class tax transparency legislation that will require multinationals, Merck included, to report on global revenues on a country by country basis. So it's not everything that we wanted, and what we recently filed this shareholder resolution, or working with others, we filed a shareholder resolution at Merck that would go the whole way. But in Australia, we have legislation now that is in effect that will require multinationals that have a presence here to report on revenues, profits, losses, taxes paid, number of workers, in a list of 40 countries that are widely regarded as tax havens countries. So that includes Singapore and Switzerland, for example, Hong Kong, and then your usual suspects in terms of Cayman Islands, Bermuda, um, um, and obviously many others. There was a list of about 40 jurisdictions. What we wanted was full reporting on every jurisdiction in which they operate. We didn't get that, but what we have in Australia is now the best tax transparency requirements in the world. We hope that public country by country reporting will become part of the UN tax convention that's being negotiated. And we hope other jurisdictions will also follow suit to require to make this a global norm. And so we do already have in the European Union, we have a public country by country regime, reporting regime for multinationals. It has a lot more loopholes and only requires companies to report on um, tax payments within EU member states, and a very small and rather absurd list of non cooperative jurisdictions, or it's referred to as the EU tax blacklist. And we've been running shareholder resolutions most recently at Merck to require companies to report fully on a public, fully report publicly on a country by country basis. And that resolution at Merck just got 23% of support from shareholders, despite opposition from management, and despite one of the two major proxy advisory firms advising against that vote. So nearly a quarter of the shareholders of one of the largest big pharma companies have supported this demand for greater tax transparency. And you can't fix the problem if you can't see it, right? Like we need to, in order for us to drive the political will, the public demands for effective tax reforms, we need to be able to see what's going on. And once people see that a company like Merck is booking profits in places like Switzerland and Ireland, and Bermuda. I think we'll get a growing demand for reforms that stop these loopholes from being exploited by multinationals. And we have that in Australia. Part of the reason why we've made some progress is that we have greater transparency already. We have 10 years of data for every company and what taxes they've paid or haven't paid over the last 10 years now. And so it was easier for the public to sort of see what the problem is and to demand even greater transparency.
So you're talking about greater transparency, but let's face it, the world's biggest economy is the US, the next biggest economy is China.
Mm.
Will either of these countries demand tax transparency? And with neither of them doing so, can you have a global just system?
So I mean, it's super interesting in that in the U.S. there's already a move towards greater tax transparency. In the U.S., the FASB, FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, has already implemented greater tax transparency requirements. So those are going into effect now, and so companies will be forced to report in a more detailed way about global tax payments. So there's some progress even in the U.S. Um, and in China, we have the Chinese government is actively cracking down on both tax avoidance by wealthy individuals and by multinational corporations. So China is actually actively pursuing tax avoidance, and so I'm optimistic that China could be a positive influence in terms of global tax affairs. And again, we also have this dynamic where the OECD has been in charge of sort of multilateral discussions and progress on addressing what they've called BEPS, the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Program. And now we have the kind of the momentum is with the UN, and been an agreement to move those discussions to the UN and to create a UN tax convention. So I do think that there's lots of opportunity for the UN to have a greater role, and for like the EU, there's lots of opportunity for regional cooperation to require greater transparency.
Yeah, so let me ask you about the UN. The UN is not exactly in the rudest of healths. It is not particularly liked by the current administration. It is dysfunctional in many aspects, and
Mm,
increasingly countries are operating outside the UN to get stuff done. I mean, look at China's
yeah,
Belt and Road Initiative as an
right.
example. That's operating outside the post-war institutional rubric created by the US, the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. So if you're placing your eggs in the UN basket, are you in danger of setting sail on a sinking ship?
No, I mean, I take your point. It is a very good point, and the UN is not, yeah, has its issues, but it is a much more democratic forum than the OECD has been, right? The OECD has been criticized for being the group of rich nations and looking after its own interests. I do think that there's a very interesting dynamic with the current US administration because they've essentially exited the leadership in terms of global tax negotiation, and well, in terms of leadership on a lot of issues, but tax in particular. And so it actually allows people to
Because,
have,
just to interject, our viewers and listeners must note that the tax deal came under Joe Biden, right? Having the minimum global tax,
right,
and that's 15%, and that came after a long period of negotiation. Am I correct
right.
in saying that?
That's correct. So Biden and the Biden administration was instrumental in pushing forward progress at the OECD on what is Pillar One and Pillar Two. So Pillar Two being the minimum 15% minimum tax, and Pillar One looks like it will fail, and has looked that way for a long time because it would have never passed. Even if Biden had won, it would have struggled to pass the U.S. Congress. But Pillar One was an
So,
attempt.
what is just rephrase it?
Pillar one was an attempt to go after the largest multinationals in the world, so particularly the tech industry, and the likes of the Microsofts, the Googles, the Metas, the Alphabets, and those companies. And we would never have had progress on Pillar one discussions had it not been for dozens of countries around the world taking initiative on digital services taxes. And what that created was enough chaos where the multinationals actually demanded multilateral action, because it was easier for them to have one multilateral approach rather than dozens of different approaches in different countries with slight variations. So I don't think we get multilateral progress without unilateral regional efforts to drive that. And I think as pillar one, the tax on the world's largest companies is not going to happen. I think we're already seeing this, right? We already have Canada has started a new digital services tax. There's live discussions about the digital services taxes between the U.S. and the U.K. The U.S. is accusing countries of attacking that this tax is focused on U.S. multinationals. It's focused on the largest companies in the IT sector, which in many cases are U.S. companies, but there's no discrimination involved in this. And what you have is a situation where Trump is essentially um, acting as a protector of the rights of U.S. companies to avoid taxes in the United States itself as well as globally. Essentially, sort of a mafia approach of trying to be a protector and stop people from collecting the taxes on U.S. companies, regardless of where the profits are made. And this is not benefiting U.S. tax revenue either, because these companies, as the case with Microsoft, are not paying what they should in the United States as well. So stopping other companies from taxing them appropriately um, is not helping the United States. It is being a protector for abusive practices of U.S. multinationals.
Got it. So you're not very optimistic about the current policy under Donald Trump. But having said that, he is notoriously flexible. Should there be meltdown, and there are increasing
Hmm.
prospects of a financial meltdown, and should he need more taxes, the Microsofts, the Alphabets, the Googles, or rather the Ubers, they were all Democrat leaning. What's
Hmm.
stopping the Republicans from raiding Democratic office?
Well, I'm all in favor. I think that they should. I think it's time to really take a hard look at who's paying for what, and who's not paying at all. And time, the U.S. is facing. I mean, with the current big beautiful bill that Trump and his allies are trying to push through Congress. I mean, the U.S. is going to have unbelievable deficits. I mean, they're already pretty record breaking, but they'll be even worse. And there's no need for this. Like the U.S. has the capacity to raise revenue from multinationals that is not going to harm them. That will, in fact, level the playing field so that we can have genuine competition and not monopoly power, as is the case with companies like Google and Microsoft that dominate those sectors. These companies and their ability to exploit tax loopholes reflects their monopoly power and their influence on policy and regulation. And forcing greater transparency, forcing them to pay what they should on the profits that they make, actually creates greater competition and innovation. And let's have companies compete on the quality of their products, on innovation, on design, on the quality of services, not the willingness and ability to exploit loopholes and stash money in offshore bank accounts.
Brilliant. On that note, thank you very, very much for your time. If you have any parting observations, comments, conclusions, please share them.
Well,
Otherwise,
I mean, I do think that, going back to this Merck resolution, and we've done resolutions that have scored, equally well at the likes of Microsoft, Cisco, Amazon, major alternative investment manager, Brookfield. There is demand from lots of quarters for increasing tax transparency, and for companies, increasingly companies are taking risks. So another pharmaceutical company, Amgen, is facing a $3 billion audit from the IRS in a shareholder lawsuit. So the demands for tax transparency are coming from all quarters, from citizens, from unions, and from investors who really want to see what's going on. And in terms of the transparency, it's hard to judge a company's uh, business plan, its performance, its future prospects, if you don't know what it's selling in markets like China, India, Brazil, right? We need to know what its footprint is in those emerging markets, in those growing countries where future revenues are going to depend on them having a presence there. And so, I'm focused on the tax aspects of this, but it's also information that investors need to make wise decisions about where to put the money. And if the company actually has a business plan that makes sense and that is forward looking rather than trying to exploit loopholes and look backward.
indeed, rather than creative financial accounting, which Enron did once upon a time. So,
Exactly.
so
Exactly.
what you're saying is that if there is better financial planning, or rather, if there is more transparency, and if there is a better tax regime, that is good for investors, that is good for governments, that is good for
Mhm.
citizens, that is good for unions, and that is especially good for shareholders in the long term, because then they actually know what is going on instead of looking at fancy bookkeeping, or fancy the equivalent of derivatives that once caused blindness, the infinite mirror
Yeah.
problem. uh, and uh, and it is the need of the hour, and it is a global need of the hour. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely. And look, I think it's good for markets and for competition. You don't want companies that can dominate and squash any attempts to challenge their business model, right? Like
Yeah,
we want upstarts, we want new companies to innovation, right? And so when you have
got it.
these large companies that dominate the system, and part of that domination is through their ability to exploit tax loopholes, a startup can't immediately set up its operation in a way where it's funneling money through Switzerland or the Bermuda or the Cayman Islands or Ireland or wherever. This is unfair for small and growing emerging businesses who can't compete in a system where large multinationals can exploit loopholes in the system.
Brilliant. You're channeling the spirit of Teddy Roosevelt, the great trust busting American president, although you're sitting in Sydney. So, well, here's to the spirit of Teddy. And of course, Tim Wu, who's channeled that spirit in our way. She's written The Curse of Bigness, and that addresses the last point you made. It's a pleasure to have you. We'll have you back for FO Talks. Those of you who are watching this on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, like this, and share this with your friends. We'll be back with Jason again, and other such guests, to discuss the most important issues of the world so that you can make sense of the world. Bye for now.
Thanks so much for having me.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.